The second keynote speaker is Carsten Neßhöver, who is deputy head of the Department of Conservation Biology at Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, ESEE in Leipzig. His presentation titled Handling the Complexities of the Science Policy Interfaces on Different Levels.
So, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much also for the organizers of inviting me. Unlike Esther, it's already my second ecological economics conference, simply because one of the earlier ones was in Leipzig, so I had the pleasure to be there as well. So, this is not the start. This is the start. So I will be actually reflecting and then coming back to some issues that Esther presented. And I'd like to take a more, also a quite practice view, because my work is related to research on science policy interfaces and at the same time also implementing them. We are also involved in IPBES, for example. So, but I also want to take a reflexive view on it, on what we have done and what we have learned about these interfaces in the last 25 years, I would say, which just making two important points. Coming back a little bit, just very shortly, about us as such a diverse group of disciplines which is here to reflect a little bit about the science role and the scientist's role that we have in the world today with these increasing environmental problems. And then I will come back to that issue of new experiments, where actually I also will talk about IPBES a little bit, but from my point of view of where we look at how IPBES is actually structured and is, if you like, explicitly working. And in the end, I would come back to the title of the session, which was given to us, and saying, well, actually, we have to come across this idea of doing experiments at the interface, but rather really doing them. And this is where I will introduce one of my projects at the moment. So first of all, two major points, which I think, after working now for quite a while at the interface, we have learned quite a lot from STS studies and other studies about science policy interfaces. The first important thing from my perspective is that as well on the conceptual side and on the practical side, we have learned quite a lot at looking at these different kind of interfaces, looking at advisory boards, at bodies like IPBES and so on. So we can now reasonably well understand them. They are quite complex, as we already heard from Esther, but nonetheless we can do quite something. We can learn about, when it comes to conceptual attributes, that either if we have a linear or a collaborative model of interfacing, so science speaking to policy or interacting with them, we have to acknowledge that if we look at these typical attributes that we talk about, oh, it needs to be credible, it needs to be relevant, it needs to be legitimate, that in the one model we are just basically look at the way the science is produced, if you look at the linear model, but it gets much more complicated when we go for a dialogue-oriented model, because everyone getting involved perceives whether something is credible, like IPBES, via the way he is involved. And so also these issues like credibility and legitimacy are not so easy to grasp. So this makes it somehow difficult, but on the end we have understood quite a lot about this. And when we look at the practical side, looking at what actually a science policy interface does it have a clear goal or function? Which structures does it have? Which processes does it follow? And which output does it deliver? We see that, of course, there are many, well, if you like, practical attributes which makes them so challenging, because institutions involved as well as individuals involved will have expectations, they will have a certain idea of independence from a scientific side. It will be about trust building, about conflict management, and so on. And all these things are related and are influencing on how such an interface is perceived in the end. And this, of course, makes it so challenging that many people, for example, involved in IPBES are unsure whether they really like it or not. But in the end, they feel that this is some space to actually bring things forward. And I think this is a very important point to summarize that. So the second point which I would like to make, that We are always thinking about the classical way of interfacing. Yeah, there will be some people writing a report and maybe it's reviewed. But today, let's think about, when we're doing an interface, let's think about beyond this classical assessment process. From many, many disciplines, we have quite a lot of different methods of synthesizing knowledge. When we look at the very sketchy policy cycle here, we can offer exploratory methods that review the existing knowledge on what does the evidence say. We can offer analytical methods of what are actually the options for policy to act. We can offer evaluation methods to see what is actually the impact of certain policies, of certain activities. And last not least, and which is becoming more and more important in these collaborative interfaces, we have engagement models which you can use nearly in every setting of every context of the policy cycle, about engagement methods that collect opinions, collect expert contributions from very different disciplines, thinking about joint fact-finding, etc. And this is, I think, a very, very important point where very often certain interface processes today only have one method of synthesis. And to make them relevant, we think that it's important to actually bring them together. If you want to hear a little bit more about this, come to our session on Thursday where Lynn Dix, the author of the paper from Eclipse on that, will be speaking. So my first conclusion is that when you are thinking of interfaces, and I might be a little bit unsure and saying, I don't know how these things work, it's a little bit like with our environmental problems. We know today what we could do better on environmental problems, and it's the same, which I think that when it comes to interfaces, we also know there what to know better compared to models we are using, and it's already happening everywhere. The second point, which I would like to make very shortly, let's reflect on the scientist's role in that. And for that, I use my dear friend from the earlier slides, the wall lizard of Dragonera, because, to be honest, all of us, otherwise we wouldn't be here, somehow transdisciplinarity booms to some extent, interdisciplinary booms. We have more and more activities there, and for a Dragonera lizard, this means going up into the shrubs and going for another resource, which are the seeds or the flowers up in the shrub. And on the other way, we are fighting with the system that we are living in, so the academic disciplinary rigor that, of course, every discipline has to work on, the competitiveness we are seeing to developing at the same time in the academic system, and so that we are actually fighting for some scarce resources. And this, of course, brings us to really, really the point that we have to reflect as individual scientists, as institutions, of how to get heard, how to get involved. We can, of course, get active advocates, either for science itself, like we have seen with the March of Science recently, or we can, of course, be advocate for a certain topic. I think we have some topics in the conference here which do that to some extent. We can also say, oh, I'm using the system that we have, which is publications, to get into the debate a little bit by writing a correspondence letter, writing a current opinion, a paper, which is already a full journal by now, writing perspectives papers. But of course, it's a question, is that enough to get engaged? Or do we go a step further and really engage with these demanding approaches that we have, especially on the global level, like IPBES, like Future Earth, and similar activities? So this is really something I think we as community and also as individual, you have to reflect about. Because in the end, we don't like it, to be honest. As a scientist, we are trained not to like compromises and really focus on good work, on credibility of our own work. But when we work at the interface, we somehow have to take them if we want to have an impact. We discussed with the summer school, for example, about impact and how difficult it is to have and to achieve. But we have to reflect on that also in terms of our academic side of that coin. So how can we find an honest way to install that also in the academic system, that the rewards for this interaction are actually taken into account? This brings me to the new experiments that we talked about a little bit, and I will now also reflect on IPBES from a different perspective, like Esther did. So this is the question, this is the way I'm looking at it, so in a way of how it functions. Well, does it really have clear functions? Does it have a structure? Does the structure help to deliver outputs? And so on. So for IPBES, this is a challenge to look at because it's still ongoing. We are having a lot of research projects going on with that and reflections. Just for those who are not so familiar with it, that it has actually quite a history. Esther mentioned already the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was a one-off approach. After that said, oh, we need something continuous on that. So there was a process to discuss that. There was preparatory meetings where they had a sort of founding document, the so-called Busan outcome, where they laid out the first official functions of IPBES. Then there was a long political process across the UN, setting up the rules, the functions, the procedures, taking as many countries on board as possible. And now, only since 2013, it's working, and which shows that actually it's still a quite new entity, and we can really look at it in detail. So when we look at these issues here on functions, structures, processes, I want to highlight something that also Esther mentioned indirectly, is that there is quite something new in it compared to earlier processes. The IPCC was only focusing on assessments, and IPBES now also does regional and thematic ones. It looks at policy tools and methodologies explicitly. It should identify them, it should foster their use, it should foster their further research. And also it has a capacity building function built in to help people get acquainted of working in IPBES and other interfaces, which is actually quite new and ambitious. On the other hand, it has a structural component, and there it comes in that in the end, to have member states and countries accepting such a new body, it's always good to put it into that framework of the UN, and there they have the rules from IPCC and similar bodies where they have experience, where they feel comfortable, so they came with a quite dense UN-like structure with it, with a plenary, with a bureau and secretariat and so on. So this was actually a challenge, and stakeholders, while they are acknowledged to play a major role, they are not official part of that structural model. And this also brings us into the problems of these assessment processes, that they have also the standard model, and the way, for example, IAK knowledge is included into that science-based model of doing an assessment is quite a challenge, and you might think about innovative approaches of doing it differently, but within that framework this is quite different, but indeed it's happening. On the other hand, you also have a lot of stakeholders who are really keen to get involved on science, on NGOs, and so on. So you can take a look there and see what's happening from the bottom-up perspective there, and also from the support and whether it's really supported by the other bodies of IPBES. In the end, the expectations are high and the dedication is high, otherwise they wouldn't have 1,000 experts by now having been or being involved right now. So you see that it's really an action and a point, but there's also a challenge. The 1,000 people are not really regional balanced, not gender balanced, and not disciplinary balanced. They still have a strong focus towards natural sciences. That's the challenge that also IPCC has for 25 years now. Then in the end, what's about the outputs? There are quite some standard outputs, as usual, which have a problem. I come to that in a moment. But they're also thinking about, well, what could we do with that policy tools idea? Can we create a catalog or something for that? So what it will mean for the outcome in the end, we don't know, but let me give a prognosis slightly. Because it's very well embedded in the global context, there's likely to play a strong role in influencing the CBD agenda from 2020 onwards, because it's designed to deliver some reports there. The link towards the SDGs is very strong, so there might be a strategic role in that, also for science in the future. But of course, when it comes to the point that they actually want to make in influencing policies, they still have this major problem that a global assessment not necessarily links back to the level of policy making when it comes to biodiversity, so the local or the national level. So they have a scale problem there, deliverable problem, and the disconnect problem, if you like. You would need to have a nested approach of having similar bodies on regional, national, and even local level to then translate back these overall visions across the scales. Then the challenges with the structures and processes, I talked about that already. So far, the strict UN standards hinder innovation. So, for example, the innovation of how we include different knowledge form in that strict scientific assessment process. There are very good ideas on the way, but it takes a long time. And also, how can we think about different output formats of not just writing big reports? Last not least, and I think we will come across this several times in the conference, is this issue of integrative aspects. How is IPBES actually playing a role in, for example, this deliberations about the ecosystem services concept with the conceptual framework and so on? And with, for example, this new term of nature contribution of people, I think someone will talk about at that place tomorrow about it. So if you're interested in that, by the way, we are also doing some evaluation work on that, and also IPBES will have an internal evaluation on that soon. So to conclude on that, these new approaches like IPBES are emerging, and this is just an example, and we have to engage them from all disciplines from my perspective. And today we should be honest and communicate also to policymakers that this kind of interfacing is the new normal of interfacing, and not anymore just a alternative to a classical way. In our complex world, in our complex problems, we have to go that way. And with that, I come to my last part, which is about the Eclipse project, where we are trying to do something similar like IPBES on the European level. I will not go into details. This is just to illustrate to you that like IPBES, we went a long road of developing that via research projects, via, well, political claims that better knowledge is needed for the field. And now today we have this project of piloting such a new mechanism. A very important difference to IPBES is that IPBES is top-down from the states, and we are creating this bottom-up from science in first place, of course with some support from policy, and especially with the funding. I will not go into details of that slide. Again, the invitation to our session on Thursday. But generally speaking, the way we want to do the SPI is slightly different is by, of course, having a request for potential questions to actually everyone from society, then going into a scoping phase with that, deciding about the exact questions, going into a call for experts group. Then what is one of the differences that we are really looking at this diversity of synthesis methods, and then we go into the production process of something like that. And there are three, I think, important elements which we want to make different, and this is what I want to highlight. First of all, we want to increase the transparency of the overall processes very much in order to really communicate what we are doing for, what each step is for, and how different groups can get engaged at any time. And this is a very, very important point. We will install a so-called ethical infrastructure. If you want to hear more about this, let me know, in order not to go beyond just a conflict of interest policy. The second point, which I mentioned already, is this issue of diversifying the use of knowledge synthesis methods, that you deliberately and consciously, with your requester, decide for your question in that time frame, with the knowledge we have, we actually would propose to use this and this method, which can be very, very credible, very natural science-based, like a systematic review, but it can also be very participatory, going towards adaptive management or similar approaches. And this is the challenge we are following there as a second point. And the third point is that we really believe that the networking and the way we are organizing as a group like this one can really make a difference in feeding that process, because when it needs to be flexible in terms of methods, in terms of the topics we tackle, we really need to engage with very different communities. And this is a challenge we are facing right now as the team, for each of the requests finding the right and addressing the right community. And of course, in the end, this community is also crucial to further disseminate all of that. So this brings me to my final point, which is the challenges that are remaining there is, of course, the communication issue. It's an issue that every interface has to some extent. As soon as you go participatory, the communication is key. And we see this also in IPBES, that there is a major challenge in that. And this directly relates to one thing which we somehow must be aware of. As soon as you involve more people and more groups into such a process, of course, the expectations are much higher and much more diverse when it comes to what is credible, legitimate, etc. And managing these expectation and resource constraints is quite a challenge. And as such a process is a social innovation, it's also quite a busy thing and a tricky thing to design a business plan for that. So having said so, if you are interested in that, if you want to get engaged, go to our website, go to the Keep Me Posted, go to our forum and get engaged. And if there are any agricultural experts in the room who are interested in working in an expert group on the Common Agricultural Policy, which we are just setting up, please go to the website and nominate yourself for the expert group. You're really warmly invited. We need a lot of experts from social sciences, from Central Eastern Europe, but also across any other discipline. So with that, I'm summing up. So my take-home message are these four. We know how to do science policy interfaces today and how to do them better. We need to acknowledge the scientists' work at the interface. We need to do that in collaborative interfaces and make them the new normal. And if you're really interested in that, you're warmly invited to join us in Eclipse. Thank you very much.